morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar, The Origin of Parliamentary Democracy, an Exploration of Devolution in the UK. My name is Bethany Elliott, the researcher in the economics section of the Embassy of the Republic of Korea, and I will be the facilitator for today's event. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from speakers and panelists who are noted academics and experts in the field of local autonomy in both the UK and South Korea. Although the pandemic may prevent us from sharing insights and ideas in person, we hope that this virtual webinar will contribute to the promotion of friendship between the two countries and the further development of exchanges between local governments. Today's webinar will be broadcast live on YouTube and will run for 2 hours. Simultaneous interpretation will be provided. Firstly, we have the honour of hearing opening remarks from the Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to London, Her Excellency Enna Park.
안녕하세요.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Enna Park, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the United Kingdom. I'd like to begin by welcoming you all to this webinar and thanking you for your interest in the topic of devolution in the UK and South Korea. I strongly believe this webinar will provide a meaningful opportunity for the public diplomacy, helping to forge a stronger understanding between our two great nations. As you know, parliamentary democracy originated in the UK, and the subject of today's webinar is thus very fitting. Designing the best structural system for devolution is a very challenging mission. Nevertheless, it's undoubtedly necessary to experiment and to then make changes based upon what works most successfully. South Korea has been gradually devolving powers and authority from central to local level for the past 25 years. However, some problems remain, such as population reduction and the lack of skilled employment opportunities outside the capital. Of course, the capital city also has critical challenges in areas like the environment and transportation and others. The UK government is also considering devolution as an important policy area.
For the British presenters, panelists, and audience, I'm certain that today's webinar will provide a good opportunity to anticipate the future direction of devolution in our two countries. I'd like to express my gratitude to all panelists, participants, and members of the audience. I would particularly like to extend my sincere thanks to our distinguished guest, Mr. Philip Clifford from the Local Government Association, and Professor Alan Harding from the Great Manchester Combined Authority, and also to all the panelists for supporting and facilitating the webinar. I would like to further express my deepest appreciation to His Excellency Ambassador, my dear friend, Simon Smith, for kindly providing welcome remarks from Seoul. Moreover, I'd like to thank Secretary General Chun Sung-hwan of the Governors Association of Korea and all members of staff for their hard work to enable this webinar to take place. Your hard work and excellent contribution are very much appreciated. The UK and South Korea have been partners throughout modern history, and it is important to further strengthen the partnership in the future. I believe that relationship between local authorities of our two countries will surely provide important platform to increase better understanding, friendship, and ties between our two peoples. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your warm opening remarks. Next, I am very pleased to say that Mr. Sung Hwan-jun, Secretary General of the Governors Association of Korea, will provide a welcome address.
I'd like to extend my deepest welcome to the Korea and UK's local government officers to the webinar titled The Origin of the Parliamentary Democracy, the Exploration of Devolution in the UK, which was hosted by GAOK and the Korean Embassy to the UK. First of all, my thanks goes to Madam Ambassador Euna Park to the Republic of Korea for your generous support in the success of the webinar in cooperation with GAOK. I also deeply appreciate British Ambassador Simon Smith to Korea, who not only showed great interest in this webinar, but is also actively promoting the revitalizing of exchanges among regional governments of both countries. I'd also like to thank the experts from both countries who have attended as presenters and panelists. GAOK has implemented various projects to promote devolution and internationalization of the local governments. In particular, GAOK has established and operated overseas offices in the overseas diplomatic offices of Korea, in the UK, France, USA, Australia, China, and Japan for local internationalization. Overseas offices have been making efforts to enable face-to-face exchanges across a number of areas, including people-to-people exchange, cultural and economic exchange. But the world faces situations to interact and unite in new ways due to COVID-19. We have been facilitating webinars since last year to continue exchanges and cooperation between local governments in Korea and abroad in any ways without stoppage. Today's webinar is part of the efforts. Currently, Korean local governments have multiple challenges in hand in common, such as drastic population decrease, job creation for youth, and regional revitalization. To address these challenges, consensus began to be formed that new cooperation between local governments was needed. As a result, the discussions on the composition of the mega regional government coalition are in full bloom. Britain is a country where local governments have been born, and in its long history, local governments have evolved through various attempts. With the experience of the mega regional government coalition ahead of Korea, we believe that the Britain's devolution will serve as a compass for local governments in Korea. In this global pandemic, local governments are at difficult times in the pursuit of economic development and people's happiness. I'm convinced that, however, the answer to this situation is solidarity. I'll keep this saying in mind that if you want to go fast, go alone, and go far, go together. And in the future, we'll continue to unite with local governments of UK in multiple aspects and actively promote projects that need cooperation. Your undivided interest and support would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General John. Lastly, we have the honour of hearing from the British Ambassador to Seoul, His Excellency Simon Smith, who will kindly deliver a welcome address.
Thank you, Bethany, and I'm going to deliver a much shorter address than I had planned because I think that people will be very keen to get on with talking about the subject matter of today's webinar. So I'll keep it brief. I will say one, thank you very much, Ambassador Park and the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the UK and the Governors Association of Korea for the initiative in setting up this event. Second, just to say that I think it's a great thrill to be participating in an event which brings together the global and the local. Globally speaking, this is a really big year for Britain and Korea. It's the year in which Korea will join us around the G7 table. It's the year in which together as leaders on the global climate change agenda, we'll come together at the COP26 conference in November. And it's the year in which Britain has just announced a new, fresh look at its international relations and recognized the really important part that the Indo-Pacific region plays in that, and also specifically the important part that our relationship, that a constantly developing relationship with Korea plays in that. And for me, I feel personally every week how important it is for us to be doing business and collaborating, not just with our friends in the capital, not just with our friends in the national government, but also at local level. We've had a lot of help from the Governors Association of Korea in reaching out at local level, in building our relationships, and that's helped us to confirm our understanding of what we already know, which is just how important activism and dynamism at the local level is to make sure that our approach to addressing global problems is a success. nowhere is that more important than in the issue of climate change, but there are so many areas in which we're finding that a vibrant and dynamic input at local level is something which can really fuel the success of our relationship on a broad sense and in a global sense. So in that sense, I'd like to say once again, thank you very much to the organisers of this meeting, and to hope that it will be a very productive source of new ideas for working together to address successfully the technological and societal challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, Ambassador Smith. We will move on to the main webinar programme. In today's webinar, there will be 2 presentations, a discussion session with our 3 panellists, and finally there will be a Q&A session for audience participation. Before we move on, I would like to notify the audience that we are accepting questions. To ensure the smooth operation of the webinar, please ask your questions through the YouTube live chat before the end of the 2 main presentations, that is 5:40 PM Korean time and 9:40 AM UK time. Additionally, for Korean local government officials who are attending this webinar, please leave your attendee details via text message or via the link provided in the live chat after the webinar. Next, I would like to notify the speakers and panellists. Please unmute your microphone only when you present or speak, otherwise remain muted. Some of the webinar sessions will be provided in Korean, so please select the English option by clicking the interpretation icon at the bottom of the screen. Now I will introduce our esteemed speakers and panellists. Mr. Philip Clifford, Senior Advisor at the Local Government Association, will present the first session on the current and future direction of devolution in the UK. Mr. Clifford has worked with partners across London local government on a range of issues and currently leads on devolution and place-based growth issues at the LGA. Professor Alan Harding, Chief Economic Advisor at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, will present a case study of the GMCA's devolution. Professor Harding oversees the analytical research work of the GMCA, which was the first combined authority in the UK. Let me introduce our panellists. Firstly, Professor Andrew Westwood is Vice Dean at the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester, and also a Specialist Advisor to the House of Lords Committee on Economic Affairs. Next, Mr. John Ho Jeong is a Professor at Kung Kwon National University. Professor Jeong has been researching the field of devolution in the UK and local development. Lastly, Dr. Young Hoon Han is Chief Director of the Public Policy Future Institute in Hansei University. Dr. Han is a legal advisor to the Ministry of Legislation in Korea. Today's moderator is Director Sang-Bum Cho, a councillor at the Embassy of the Republic of Korea and also Chief Director of the UK Office of the Governors Association of Korea. In his role, he endeavours to promote exchanges between local governments in the UK and South Korea, including organising today's webinar. Going forwards, Director Cho will act as moderator and facilitate the webinar presentations and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Hello, my name is Sang-Bum Cho, and I'm the Director of the UK Office of the Governors Association of Korea. First, I would like to express my gratitude to today's renowned presenters, panelists, and audience members in the UK and Korea for their valuable support and input in organizing this webinar. As you may already know, the UK has very centralized system. Westminster holds very strong power and authority. Nevertheless, there was a bill passed allowing devolution to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland in 1998. But we will mainly focus on today in England. For approximately the last 10 years, in England, there have been 10 combined authorities created as intermediate level organizations, strengthening decentralization outside of the capital. An example of this is the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, also known as the GMCA. Yes, in Korea, at the end of last year, the local autonomy law was amended so that local government can adopt a special local authority structure. This will allow local government movement to adopt a local council model similar to the UK, which potentially could replace the existing directly elected mayor model. Lately, there has been an active discussion about creating special local authorities in the non-capital region to promote local economic development. I believe today's presentation sessions will cover these issues, and I hope this webinar provides academic insight and experiences regarding the devolution process in the UK. Thank you. Considering the time limit, I will do my best to help our speakers and the panelists focus on each session. Now, Mr. Philip Clifford from the LGA will deliver a session regarding the current and the future direction of devolution in the UK. Mr. Clifford, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about the current and future direction of devolution in the UK. So let's kick off with a bit of an overview of what I'm going to say. First, I think it's worth to provide a bit of introduction both to the LGA and also to the UK context. Second, and perhaps the main focus of my presentation, will be around recent experiences of English devolution. Then I'm going to move on to thinking about the future direction of devolution in the UK and close with some thoughts and reflections and potential lessons for South Korean decentralization. So, by way of introduction, the Local Government Association is the national voice of local government. We're a membership organisation with 435 members, including Welsh local authorities, and we have two main activities. So one is around policy, public affairs and communications advice. So within the context of devolution, that would be around campaigning to expand the breadth and depth of English devolution. And we also have a second responsibility around improvement, development and leadership support. And that means working with local areas to strengthen their governance and delivery arrangements and sharing best practice between combined authorities. So less about lobbying, more about improving and helping. And within the context of the English devolution experience, that'd be around advising areas on their deal making and how to successfully run a combined authority. Our priorities, probably very similar to priorities of local government in South Korea: funding the local government, focus on adult social care and children's social care, looking at narrowing some of the inequalities and protecting our communities, particularly along the lines that have been exposed by the coronavirus pandemic, strengthening local democracy, thinking about best places to live through interventions around planning and transport, and finally, as already flagged, who could describe a situation at the moment without addressing sustainability and climate action, which has really gone up the agenda in the last decade. There are different arrangements in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and I'll touch on those shortly. So, just in case, we need a bit of orientation, a couple of slides on the geography of the UK. Here's Britain, circa AD 802, made up of 4 kingdoms. And here's the United Kingdom, 2021. I think it's fair to say in a nutshell, the governance arrangements and complexity between, we draw a line between the Anglo-Saxon era to the UK with a complicated history of involving the Industrial Revolution and processes of reform and changes. But suffice to say, we could spend a long time talking about the administrative arrangements of the UK. They're very complicated and very detailed. There we are, different arrangements in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. And just to say, we can focus really on England. So let's look at the governance of the UK. The UK government is based in Westminster, in London, and it's highly centralised by comparable international standards. In Scotland, there's a list of matters reserved to the UK government, explicitly listed in the Scotland Act. Any matter not explicitly listed in the Act is implicitly devolved to the Scottish Parliament. For example, health, housing, education and justice, they're matters for Scotland. Things like defence, they're matters for the UK government. In Wales, there's a similar arrangement. The Wales Act 2017 provides that any powers not explicitly devolved to the Welsh administration, Welsh Parliament, are reserved to the UK government. So, for example, Wales has powers over education, health and social care, and some taxes. Similar arrangements to Scotland, but not quite as deep. In Northern Ireland, it's again more complicated, reflecting the history of the territory and the complexities of governance around there. There are three categories of power in Northern Ireland. Transferred powers, i.e. those that have already been passed the Northern Assembly, include powers of agriculture, education and transport. Reserved powers currently remain in Westminster, but might be transferred at a later date, for example, around prisons. And exempted powers, which cannot be transferred to the Northern Ireland Assembly without special intervention from Westminster. And they include powers around elections and also defence. But as I said, I'm going to focus on England. And one of the peculiarities of the UK system is that while England dominates the Union, both geographically and economically and in terms of demography, there's no national devolved settlement. There's no English Parliament. There's no particular arrangements for powers being devolved specifically to England. Instead, what we see is a spread of subnational devolution deals. So, in order to get and understand that, I'm going to talk a little bit about local government in England. As I said at the beginning, it's pretty complex, so we'll try and talk through with clarity and carefully. First thing to note is that local government in England doesn't have any constitutional underpinnings or protection. Councils in England are creatures of statute, and that's reflected in the fact that councils provide more than 800 public services with 1,200 legal duties. They are defined by these duties rather than by an overarching legal construct. What kind of services do I mean? Well, we're talking about services for children, vulnerable adults, cultural services, and perhaps on the more economic intervention side, services around highways, transport, housing and environment. In some parts of non-metropolitan England, i.e. those places outside the city regions, these functions are split. District councils provide more local services around housing, planning, and larger county councils provide more strategic services like adult social care and waste disposal. We call this two-tier governance. And although the services are distinct, there's a degree of collaboration between both district and county councils. In metropolitan areas, i.e. in urban areas, these functions are delivered by a single unitary authority. In city regions, such as London and Greater Manchester, these local delivery functions are supported by subnational strategic authorities. This is the real focus of devolution and something we'll get onto. But for example, in Manchester, we have the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and in London, we have the Greater London Authority. These sit above the delivery arms of the unitary authority that I've mentioned so far. At a very, very small scale, we have parish councils. These are hyper-local organisations made up of covering maybe a town or a village. And some of the high-level statistics, cross councils in England, we have about 20,000 councillors, employ about 2 million employees, and spend about £50 billion a year. So that's the structure, and that's the governance. Before we go on, the last slide of background is around local government finance. And I think this is very complicated, but also very important to understand the context we're going to get into. So in short, local government in England is funded by four main sources: sales, fees and charges. So for example, things like leisure services or parking, the council can charge for. Council tax, which is a locally raised property tax. Business rates, which are retained locally, collected to basically a property tax on business, and also government grant. There are a couple of things to note about this. So as the slide shows, the balance between government grant, which is the blue bar, and council tax has changed in the last decade. Much less money coming from government in terms of grant, much more money, much more of a reliance on local taxation, particularly council tax. Now, unlike other taxes or other local taxes, these taxes are subject to a very significant level of control. So although, for example, council tax is raised locally, the level at which it can be set is defined by the centre. There's a referendum on this. So councils are encouraged to raise it simply to kind of cover their operating costs, but they can't set whatever they like. They also can't introduce new taxes. So there's a heavy degree of central control over this arrangement. There are two more important things to notice and note around local government finance as it relates to in the UK. The first is that councils are legally required to balance their budgets. It doesn't matter, so whereas a national government can run a deficit or move outside the parameters of its operating income in response to a crisis, councils can't do that. They're legally required to balance it. So this has meant that as the availability of public funds has decreased over the last decade, financial crisis. You can see it again around response to the pandemic. Councils have had to reduce their services. They can't raise money locally. So as a reliance on a national framework, they've had to cut their expenditure by about 60%. This has created a pretty significant reduction in public services. And the second thing to note is that internationally, as you can see on the little chart here, we're pretty centralized, and you can see the kind of aqua-coloured blob is the UK, and we're kind of far down and right in the corner where a kind of very low degree of autonomy, and Korea is in red. So internationally, we're pretty centralized. So we've got a centralized system, we've got a complex system, we've got a system that's dominated by Westminster. So let's think about how that relates to devolution in England. So I think one of the most interesting places to kick off with a conversation about devolution is to really sit down and think about why you're actually doing it. Why does the government, why does anyone want to go down it? I think in the UK, or at least in England, there have been 4 purposes. And I would say there were contested purposes, but we can talk through that, and maybe I'll reflect on that a little bit later on. So certainly under the coalition government, under George Osborne, one of the main drivers of English devolution was around rebalancing the economy. And I've got a little chart here which really goes some way to describing this, but there's also international comparisons as well. The economy of the UK, and certainly the economy of England, is dominated by London and the South East. And the chart on the right of the screen you're seeing there really shows that. It shows gross value added per head over the English regions. And you can see that London has romped ahead, well ahead of the rest of the country, recovered more quickly from the economic crash of 2009. And it was strongly believed that the second tier cities, Liverpool, Greater Manchester, Birmingham, weren't punching at their, weren't punching into one to keep track with London, but also when compared to kind of European cities like Frankfurt and Munich, also weren't punching on their same weight internationally. So rebalancing the economy away from London and the South East was one of the primary motivators of the government for introducing devolution in particularly in city regions. The second bit is what we call public service reform. Part of a product of a very centralized system is that you end up with a lot of national public services that are delivered locally in an incredibly fragmented way. And this is perhaps a little difficult to see, but if you start to unpick on any particular subject like skills intervention or health or employment, you end up with a lot of government agencies, a lot of funding pots, a lot of different interventions coming down from the centre, arriving at a local area and trying to join those up and make sense of addressing an individual or an economy's needs is very difficult. So it was argued that a combined authority, a strategic authority, would provide a way of both bringing up services that were delivered by the local authorities in that area, but also national public services delivered locally into a single coherent package. So you have a way of defragmenting those public services around the individual and around places. I guess the third element is what I've called place-based politics. And I think this has 2 aspects. The first is around the argument that bringing power closer to local communities provides for greater granularity, greater control over the decisions that matter to people. I think it's also worth reflecting at the time, thinking about some of the political arrangements, political direction of the government about giving areas a voice on the national stage. Both of these, I would say, are important elements of place-based politics. And the picture here is of George Osborne, the Conservative Chancellor, signing the first devolution deal with Manchester, with Richard Leese, the Labour leader of Council of Manchester. And it was a really significant moment that kick-started this process, really. And I guess the kind of final point is what I've kind of called the efficiency agenda. And this is the argument that within the context of constrained fiscal envelope, bringing services together and bringing it at place, recognizing the kind of financial constraints and the efficiency of local government, that bringing these services together actually saves money. So 4 purposes, depending on where you are in the kind of debate, these are more or less important. But I would say in that order, it's probably really characterized the devolution debate in England so far. You can see that, I think, reflected in the deals that went forward. So we have 4 overlapping purposes. We could talk a little bit about the process, about how we got there. So I won't spend too long on this, it's a bit dry, but I think it's worth reflecting that, really you can look back and see the 1999 GLA Act established the Greater London Authority. And it's interesting that the Greater London Authority received another act in 2007, further devolution to London, very different arrangements, I think, from the rest of the country. 2009, I think, is where it starts to get more interesting. The Local Democracy, Economic Development and Construction Act really set out the basis for new governance structures outside of London, combined authorities, for example. In 2011, there was something called the Localism Act, more power for London, and a general power for councils and communities. And 2016, I think, is where it really hits home. It's the Local Cities and Local Government Devolution Act, wide-ranging legislation, which was really enabling, using the basis of the 2009 Act, which established combined authorities, to think about how mayoral combined authorities might be set up across the rest of the country. So I think there are 2 points. Well, there's kind of one big point here, is that London is very different from the rest of the country. The powers and functions that London had are enshrined in statute. In other parts of the countries, they're not enshrined in statute, with the exception of the Health to Greater Manchester. And the differential approach, which we might get into in some of the discussion, I think is interesting, because obviously there's a great degree of flexibility if the powers that you're passing down to combined authorities are contingent on your deal, rather than being set out in legislation. And of course, any talk about legislation wouldn't be, in this year, wouldn't be complete without mentioning the Devolution and Local Recovery White Paper, which we expect later in the year, and we're looking at see how it might change English devolution. So if that's legislative process, what is the actual deal-making process? Well, in the summer of 2015, under George Osborne, Her Majesty's Treasury opened an open invitation for devolution deal bids across the country. 34 bids, and you can see on the map there, which is where some of those parts are, of varying depth and detail. I think that reflected that it was an open invitation. Some areas like Greater Manchester had a long history of working together and were probably a bit more advanced, but other areas were able to come forward too. These deals were received by the centre. They looked at by a cross-government team who really scrutinised them for deliverability, ambition, and consensus. Some of those areas were knocked out in this first round simply because they didn't stack up in terms of logic. But for those that passed this initial test, the process went on to face-to-face political negotiations between ministers and local areas. And there was, within that, I think it's worth stressing that the government at the time had a strong preference for directly elected mayoral combined authorities. And this is quite unusual, I think, this deal-based approach. I think, as I said, councils are creatures of statute. The idea that with a very strong central Westminster control, the idea that you have to go and actually sit down with ministers and argue about how it works in practice and what you might get in return was novel. And I think it's fair to say that not everyone was prepared for that. However, we can see here that some areas were prepared. So kicking off with Manchester in November 2014, Sheffield City region, Greater Manchester had a second deal. You can see following through that was really a kind of period of activity, probably between 2015 and 2017, where areas came forward with their ideas and negotiated them with government. Now, some, like the North East Combined Authority or Greater Lincolnshire, fell. And they fell because the government insisted on consensus. They insisted on changes to government structures that were difficult to land. Pretty hard test. You can also see that, with the exception of the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, which has got elections this May, really the process slowed after 2017. We'll get to that in a second, but I think that underpins the extent to which devolution in England has been driven by politics at the centre, rather than having a kind of being able to draw down powers at a local level. And when things changed, for example, the vote to leave the European Union and the withdrawal process, or indeed the coronavirus pandemic arrived, issues of national concern, the devolution agenda has kind of slowed. And just to kind of sum up, here we are, here's the current state today, and you can see the orange areas are the areas that put in deals. You can see that largely, quite a lot of people put in deals, and the green areas that actually were successful in devolution deals. And I think that reflects, well, demonstrates pretty clearly both the urban bias and in existing devolution deal process, but also demonstrate a lot of interest versus those who are actually successful. So I think it's worth saying a little bit about the powers that have actually been devolved within this process. So reflecting perhaps the number one purpose of devolution, most of the powers that have been passed down are focused on economic intervention: skills, growth funding, transport, housing, those that are seen to drive the economy and strengthen economic performance at a local level. There have been some elements of public service reform, I would say not many. Greater Manchester clearly has health devolution. There's been some interventions around justice and police and crime commissioners, but not to the same degree as the economic interventions. I think a crucial bit in reflecting both Whitehall's role and also the role of the UK government in this is a strong sense that the willingness of different government departments to devolve is crucial to the shape of the deals. We were talking, as I said earlier, we were talking about a process where local areas had to go to the centre and try and negotiate without anything to fall back on, no legal basis to fall back on. And the willingness of different departments to pass down powers was crucial in terms of what you actually got out of the deal. Said earlier, there's a strong preference for combined authority. It's also interesting to note that individual areas were able to negotiate which powers went to the mayor and which powers stayed with the combined authority. And just for detail, the combined authority is the board, essentially, made up of the individual local authorities that sit within a combined authority area. So, for example, in the case of Greater Manchester, the combined authority is made up of the 10 unitary leaders within the Greater Manchester combined authority area, and the chairman of the board is the mayor of Greater Manchester. Greater London has its powers and functions defined in primary legislation, Transport for London, policing, economic development, and fire. Mayoral combined authorities, as I've said, it's more a mixed picture of policy co-design, secondary legislation, and primary legislation, such as health for Greater Manchester. So I realise that's pretty complicated and quite detailed and quite pressed for time, but what are the key takeaways, I think, from some of this? So first, it's worth saying that English devolution hasn't been framed by any clear constitutional principle or a presumption in favour of devolution to local areas, rather an interplay of political and economic forces. Second, the process has largely followed an iterative, deal-based approach with periods of activity driven by the centre. With no constitutional principle or process for local government to hook onto, I think it's fair to say that when the centre has been interested in devolution, that's when it's been available. If the centre hasn't been able or willing to kind of tender devolution, then it hasn't been available to local areas. And certainly those areas that lost out under the 2015 open call for devolution bids had no mechanism really to get back into the frame. So far, English devolution has focused primarily on urban areas, and there have been specific arrangements for London that haven't been replicated elsewhere. A bit of a debate about whether that's right or wrong, but that's how it is. The basket of, I think crucially, and maybe Alan will say a little bit more about this, the basket of powers that Greater Manchester, who really went first, and the West Midlands Combined Authority broke new ground. They didn't really unlock universal opportunity for other areas. And certainly even amongst those combined authorities that were successful in securing a devolution deal, it's a sense that after the first two deals were over the line, then perhaps the government's willingness to give up powers, to give up controls to the local level, slightly waned, and the subsequent deals weren't as potent as the first two deals. It's also worth underscoring within the context of a very fiscally centralised system that there's been very little degree of fiscal devolution. And I think if you were being really hard, you'd probably say there's very little degree of devolution in general at all. It's probably better viewed as a form of decentralisation or licensed exemption from national conditions within a highly centralised context. So a couple of thoughts just to round off on future direction in the UK. As I flagged earlier, we're expecting a devolution white paper, precursor to potentially to some legislation. In England, I think one of the key questions will be around this latent desire to address challenges of geography and governance. That very complicated governance system I flagged right at the beginning looks messy from the centre. And I think there's, at the local level, there are always arguments about degrees of scale and accountability and democratic representation. But there's something around that from the centre where it still looks quite messy and quite difficult. It'll be interesting to see whether the government continues to insist on mayors, particularly given the gaps in the kind of devolution map around rural areas. I think the kind of jury is still out on the mayoral model. I think post-pandemic, we're likely to see a core offer from government around skills and transport with an emphasis on, as I said, levelling up, which is about addressing inequalities and differential prosperity prospects across the country. I think fiscal devolution is unlikely in the short term, but some of the experiences of integrated public service provision that have been provided at a local level around the pandemic, I think will potentially pay dividends, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes. I think the relationship between English metropolitan mayors and this government has been interesting. Certainly there's been, I think it's fair to say, some tensions between some mayors standing up and representing their communities, and all eyes, I think, will be on May's elections to see who wins the elections and how that plays out with the new mandate. Developments in Scotland, as you'll be aware, there are also conversations in Scotland around devolution and potentially independence. And I think it's fair to say the experience of England will be coloured by what happens in Scotland. There's no getting away from that. I think it's worth saying a bit about what the LGA wants. So I think very briefly, we want devolution deals to be locally led. We want devolution deals to leave nothing off the table. You recall a lot of the deals so far have really focused on economic interventions, so we'd like to see that expanded. Let devolution be backed by adequate resources, given the fiscal environment and the financial constraints local authorities face. I think we feel that individual devolution deals should form part of a wider push towards localization. And what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of these powers, a lot of the kind of questions around place-based leadership, or the experiences local communities face, that we don't feel it should be contingent on a deal-based process that might happen every 5 years. That feels slightly out of kilter with the experience of running a community. So we're great to push towards local control. And finally, we think English council should have a stronger voice on the national stage and think about how we might influence and shape policy going forward. Lessons for South Korean self-centralization. Well, I'll touch on this shortly, but I think later in the Q&A, I think it's worth reflecting on the functional economic areas that have been crucial to the administrative architecture of English devolution deals, underpinned by the focus of economic rebalancing. And I think there was something really important about the role of combined authorities and being able to cross administrative boundaries and actually look at functional economic areas. Because certainly in England, that long history of how you establish counties and districts, they don't match the modern economy. So to have a strategic layer that actually does address that was really important. I think the deal-making process, while of its time, was crucial in helping a centralised Whitehall overcome its inertia and getting local areas to put forward their best case and put in place sustainable governance arrangements. I think local governance reform is not a silver bullet, and that there will continue to be tensions around service delivery footprints, accountability, and subsidiarity. I think it's hard to fully unpick the impact of coronavirus on the future shape of the economy, but it's useful to understand its medium-term implications. And certainly one of the things that we're thinking about at the moment is the extent to which the rise of home working or shifts in demography away from cities will influence on future interventions around the economy and governance. And I think it's also worth reflecting that fiscal decentralization, when you actually look at it, and when you look at it on a large scale, thinking about how that might work in practice, well, that hinges on the ability to manage risk and uneven growth. And certainly one of the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic has really put an emphasis on the ability of local areas to look after themselves. And clearly if your business rates fall through the floor because the economic activity has ceased, then in a fully fiscally devolved settlement, how a local area is actually going to be able to respond to that? Is it realistic to assume that they'll be able to respond without intervention from the centre? And I think the final point is just to reflect that mayors and subnational governments add value in terms of speaking up for their local areas, but in a context where in the UK, where the UK dominates, that can create political tensions, and it's worth allowing some space for that. So thank you very much for your time. Great to speak to you, and I'm really looking forward to a conversation later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford, for providing an excellent session. It was very helpful to understand the overall direction and also the main issues regarding devolution in England. It was very impressive to hear you argue that the UK's devolution case study makes us think about the consequences of how devolution relates to economic performance, tax base, and political accountability. Thank you again for the comment for providing implications for South Korea. Now, Professor Alan Harding from GMCA will deliver a case study of Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Professor Harding, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, sorry. So whilst those slides are appearing on the screen, let me say sorry for the technical hitch. Secondly, we very much welcome the initiative which our Korean colleagues have taken in developing this webinar as part of our rethinking of where the UK fits in the national picture. As our ambassador has said, there's been a great deal of rethinking, not just at national, but also at local level. So we're very keen to explore common challenges, common solutions to some of the issues which we face by sharing our knowledge and experiences direct with other cities and metropolitan areas across the globe, including in Korea and the broader Asian Pacific area. So hopefully this is a start of a meaningful relationship. I'm gonna spend the next 25 minutes or so building on the excellent presentation which Philip has already given us. And I'm going to start that by just by painting a little bit of a picture of where Greater Manchester fits within the national scene. So if you can click onto the first slide, please. That just tells you what Philip has already indicated. The UK is made up of 4 different constituent nations. In the case of 3 of those nations, the ones shaded in green on that figure, there is serious levels of devolution. There is nothing in England that matches the levels of devolution which are given to Scotland in the north of that picture, to Northern Ireland, which is part of the country of Ireland, to the west there, and in Wales in the southwest. These are nations. They have reasonably historically independent cultures. They have their own languages to some extent, although they're not spoken by everybody. They have traditions of lawmaking and culture, which are very different from anything you find in England. The red blob up in the middle of that picture there is Greater Manchester, and it lies within the northwest region of England. We have regions in England, but they have never played a very significant role in terms of national administration. We've had some relatively weak bodies for economic development, which were organised on a regional scale. But essentially, as Philip has described, in terms of governance, we have national government within the English context, and we have local government, and we have a history of vacillation, of change, of churn in the things that fit in between the locality and the nation. Okay, click onto the next slide. This just gives you a quick visual impression of of how Greater Manchester is made up. We've got just short of 3 million people within Greater Manchester. The largest of the 10 districts is the City of Manchester, but you will notice that even though it's the largest, it only makes up something like 1/6 of the total population of the conurbation. Click onto the next slide. That just gives you a more accurate view of the geography of Greater Manchester. The important thing about that slide, I think, is it makes clear the extent to which the entire conurbation is focused on the City of Manchester in particular. So you'll see each of those blue lines represents the main motorway systems. The transport infrastructure is very much centred on the centre of the conurbation. But if we look in a little bit more detail, the area in the centre of the conurbation, which has been the centre of most of the major high-level employment growth in the last 20 to 30 years, it's also been the centre of most of the new population growth in the conurbation. And so we have a fairly centralised economy within the conurbation, but it doesn't all fall within the city's administrative boundary. The regional centre, as we call it, includes the centre of Manchester. It could arguably include also the airport, which is to the south of the City of Manchester, but it also includes what used to be the major inland port in an adjacent city called Salford, and what was at one time the world's biggest new industrial park in the borough of Trafford. The regional centre spans 3 different administrative districts, and we've never changed the geography of those districts very significantly, which means automatically there has to be some level of collaboration between those 3 districts at minimum in terms of the management of an important part of the economy of Greater Manchester. Click onto the next, if you would. One of the issues we were asked to look at was the extent to which political parties dominate local politics. There is no doubt whatsoever that local politics is a reflection of national politics in the UK. So in contrast to Scotland and to Wales and to Ireland, there is no significant regional party. In England, our local elections are dominated by the three major national political parties: Labour, Conservative and Liberal Democrat. But the point to make here is that these are just three snapshots of the way in which the districts of Greater Manchester were controlled by different political parties. It is an area of the country reflecting its industrial heritage and past, which has traditionally been dominated by the Labour Party. But the important point to get over here is it's never been absolutely dominated by the Labour Party. Always at various points in history, in the recent history of Greater Manchester, some of those districts have been Conservative controlled, so the blue shaded areas in those maps, and some have also been controlled by the Liberal Democrat Party. Labour is the preeminent political force in Greater Manchester, but it is not the absolutely dominant force, which means that if you're trying to achieve collaboration politically, there is always a need for collaboration and compromise. The other thing which a mixed picture of political control has done for Greater Manchester is given it a voice, a local voice within national government at different times. So whilst the local political scene has changed, we've had changes of national government, of course. Greater Manchester has always been able to speak to some extent to our national government, because there's always been a representative of national government in control of one part of Greater Manchester or another. And I think that's an important side issue to note. Please go on to the next slide. Very quickly, in terms of the economy, I've said we've had growth in the population of Greater Manchester. It's been particularly in the centre of the conurbation, and it has been particularly driven by migration and immigration. Migration from the rest of the country and immigration from other parts of the world, Europe and beyond. It is an economy which is very much dominated by small and medium-sized businesses, 110,000 of them. The value of the economy in Greater Manchester is greater than some of the countries of the UK, bigger than Wales, for example. It's more valuable than regions within England, and it's bigger than some smaller European countries. 1.3 million people working in GM, expected to rise by at least 100,000 over the next period. And just one particular feature of the economy is the importance of higher education, research and development. We have 6 higher education institutions in Greater Manchester, which play host to over 100,000 students each year. Please go to the next slide. Philip has mentioned most of these points, so I won't labour them, but the Greater Manchester as a geography was created by one of the biggest local government reorganisations ever seen internationally, which reduced the number of local authorities in the UK from something like 2,000 down to the current just over 300. So a huge reorganisation of local government, which has created some of the biggest units of local government by population size anywhere in the world. A particular feature of that reorganisation, which occurred in practice in 1974 in England and Wales, in 1975 in Scotland, was that for the very first time we tried to recognise the way in which industrialisation had changed the way our places worked. So London had always is at the forefront of change within the UK. London's government had been reorganised in the mid-60s. 6 other metropolitan areas were created in that reorganisation. Greater Manchester appeared on the administrative map for the very first time in 1974. Had that not been the case, my argument would be we wouldn't have a GMCA now. It imprinted a geography that we have respected and built on ever since, in a way that a bottom-up process could never have done. What it also did, though, was created a counterbalance, a political counterbalance to national government, which became extremely problematic in the 1980s, so that by 1986, each of those metropolitan counties had been abolished, and the functions transferred downwards to mainly to the districts. Just keep on clicking that slide, please. These are also the other things which Philip mentioned: changes in the funding and the delivery of local government services, the centralisation of finance, but also the marketisation of local government functions. So 30 years ago, Manchester City Council, for example, would have probably employed something like 30,000 people. It would have been involved in the delivery of all local education, and it was the owner of 60% of the housing within the city of Manchester. Now all of the ownership of that housing has passed to independent providers, and many of those education services are provided directly by local schools who get their money from national government. So there's been enormous change in the functions and the financing of local services. The latter 2 points really are the important things for Greater Manchester. Devolution in Greater Manchester was always seen as a means of recovery from industrial decline, which was at its peak from the 1990s. It peaked in the 1990s, had been an ongoing process from at least the mid-1970s. And the sense in Greater Manchester was always that an advantage was passed to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland through the devolution process at the end of the last century, and it needed to have a component within the English context as well. That particularly was strengthened by the recreation of a statutory city regional authority for London, our capital, again at the end of the last century. Go on. So what happens in this context is that you get a transition from the abolition of a metropolitan county in 1986 over a 30-year period to the creation of the GMCA as we know it today. I think Greater Manchester's journey was unique within the English context. I'm not going to labour each of the elements of this transition, but what effectively happened in 1986 was many of the functions of the county were passed back down to individual local districts. Some of those functions were kept organised at the metropolitan scale. So we had a transport authority, we had a waste disposal arrangement for the whole of Greater Manchester. The police remained organised at the metropolitan scale. The fire service remained organised at the metropolitan scale. Uniquely, within the UK, the international airport of Manchester is owned by the 10 district authorities, with the city being the major shareholder and the rest of the districts being minority shareholders. So there was a framework of metropolitan organisation which was distributed across a number of different institutions, and unless Greater Manchester had acted differently, a balkanised system of local government delivery. What the Greater Manchester authorities did uniquely in the English context is decided through initially a completely voluntary arrangement to try and retain some semblance of metropolitan ideas, understanding the interrelationships between the different parts of the conurbation. I think mainly because the local government reorganisation had given a set of administrative boundaries which didn't make any economic sense. So the whole unit made economic sense, but the individual units within it didn't. I think that was recognised very powerfully in Greater Manchester in the way it wasn't elsewhere. What this slide tells you is just some of the initiatives which were created by those district authorities as those processes evolved. So MIDAS, for example, right in the middle of that slide, is the Inward Investment Agency, which 3 of the local authorities originally created. So that's the 3 at the centre of the conurbation, Manchester, Salford and Trafford, knowing that their independent efforts and to try and attract new investment and new firms were going to be competitive with one another unless they had a collaborative relationship. Once that was established and it was performing well, all of the rest of the Greater Manchester authorities decided to join in. And this is a common pattern. The things tend to be driven by different local authorities, in many instances the City of Manchester, but they become Greater Manchesterized, if you like, over time. And there are a number of examples of that. You can go to the next slide. We get to the more recent picture. The thing I should emphasize here, 2 things really. One I'll return to is the importance of evidence in demonstrating the Greater Manchester case in all of this. The second is that for most of this period, from 1986, when the Metropolitan County was abolished, to, I would argue, maybe 2005-06, national government had no interest in this stuff whatsoever. So I slightly disagree with Philip when he says that devolution within England has been driven by national government. It has been transacted by national government. I personally do not think we would have had a movement towards combined authorities had Greater Manchester not gone through this process and argued very strongly to national government that this was potentially a model for other areas of England too. So in that period, in that later period, from the turn of the century up until about 2005, those arguments started to have some traction, I would argue. And it's only really, we only get the deals process that Philip has described at the point at which national government has recognised that it's got incredibly tricky issues on all of the things that Philip mentioned, very difficult issues around economic rebalancing, differences between regional economic performance, and many of the issues that Philip mentioned. Had Greater Manchester not gone through this process and had the beginnings of a solution to give to national government, I don't think our national picture would have taken the form it did. But what it did mean was that Greater Manchester was at the front of the queue in terms of organising for designation as a combined authority. And that happened really in 2 stages. And it was all underpinned by the things that Philip has told us about the deal-making process. So if you can go to the next slide. Sorry, this is a bit slow. What the next couple of slides deal with is evidence of the devolution deals. They weren't all called devolution deals. Some were called city deals. One was called a devolution deal, I believe. There was an independent health and social care deal, which was negotiated too. Because Greater Manchester was at the front of the queue, it was early into the process that Philip described. And what started with a powerful interest in economic development was translated through into sets of specific powers and resources which were delivered at the city regional level. The one exceptional item which Philip has also drawn our attention to is a health and social care deal which was given to Greater Manchester. We should be very careful in describing this as devolution. It is delegation. It allows Greater Manchester to draw a line around the budgets given to our national health organisations, our hospital trusts, our acute medical services, and the local government responsibilities around public health. What has been created in Greater Manchester is a way of being flexible about the use of some of those resources between different parts of the health infrastructure. But it's not the case at all that all of the powers for providing health in all of its forms has been delegated to Greater Manchester. We have some flexibility in the way those things happen, and we also got a transformation budget out of that process, which enables some experiments to be done which try and anticipate some of the issues which send people into clinical care, which if we handled in a different way would save resources, provide early intervention and save resources in the longer term. If you can go to the next slide and the following one. The devolution deals were agreed in stages over a period of 4 or 5 years. Philip's quite right to point to the importance of a single national government. The coalition government was by far the most interested national partner that we've ever had in terms of agreeing devolution deals. Right, is the slide show stuck? Can we move forward? And move forward one more as well, please. So in terms, I think Philip has already mentioned the constitutional aspects that I wanted to cover. The national legislation which provided us the powers to implement the arrangements for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. The budgets issue, I think, is very interesting. Philip has mentioned that we have got a very centralised fiscal system within England, and that the reliance on national resources by local government is very strong. As a combined authority, the GMCA has no direct taxation powers at all. It gets a small part of its revenue income from what we call a precept, which is levied on districts. So everybody in Greater Manchester gets a council tax bill once a year. An element of that council tax bill is earmarked for the mayor, essentially, in the same way as other Greater Manchester services in policing, in fire, and in transport also have an element of that council budget. Most of the income for the GMCA is from high levels of government, mainly from national government, also for the time being from the European Union. And the budgets are not huge. So I put some figures in that slide there. Getting close to £1 billion of revenue funding per year, which is just about the same as for a single district in Greater Manchester, Manchester City Council, which is the biggest of the districts. 68% of the income of the core things that the GMCA does comes from government grants, only 4% from direct contributions from the district. So you can see the reliance on national government grant for sustaining the combined authority movement, which is something of an issue going forward. The fiscal question is something that we haven't become close to resolving. Click to the next slide, please. That just gives you a quick overview of the breadth of the sorts of strategies which the combined authority is involved in. It has a bit part to play in all of these things. Is probably the short way of describing this. I think we can go to the next slide. I was trying to think about lessons for South Korea from what Greater Manchester has been able to achieve. The economic orientation of these strategies clearly dominated for most of the period I've described, that 30-year period. It has begun to change a little bit under the mayor, as Philip described. The mayor has been particularly interested in issues to do with housing, particularly rough sleeping on the streets of Greater Manchester, where he's made a significant amount of difference. But still, we have a set of priorities which are primarily informed by economic considerations. That has helped in terms of collaboration between different parts of the conurbation, which clearly see that they are in this together. Developing institutional innovations at the pace of the fastest rather than the slowest partner, I think, has been important. Sometimes it's been 2 or 3 authorities that have led in the development of something which was later taken up by all of the districts. There's been an extremely pragmatic approach by Greater Manchester's leaders to relations with national government. Partly that's a reflection of the politics that I described earlier on. Partly it's intelligent use of allies by Greater Manchester politicians in dealing with government. It's often more useful to get business leaders from Greater Manchester to argue a case, particularly when we have a Conservative national government, than it is adopting a politicised approach. The essential way in which Greater Manchester has approached relations with national government is not about trying to get powers or necessarily trying to get more money. It has been arguing, what are your priorities for this place? How do they match our priorities for this place? What can we do together to realise collaborative and consensual priorities that we both share? What is the best way of doing that? And what needs to be devolved in order to achieve that? The commitment to evidence-based policy is absolutely central to this. Greater Manchester has always felt the need to be able to engage with government as an equal and an intellectual equal, and a great deal of investment has been put into the evidence base for policy developments. And we are lucky in Greater Manchester to have a stable and long-term political and executive leadership. I think I've got a slide, the next one, which just shows 4 of the principal figures. Very briefly, top left, Sir Howard Bernstein, long-term Chief Executive of the City of Manchester, first head of paid service for the GMCA, a very influential national figure who was central to the negotiations in the deal processes in recent years. To his right, Sir Richard Leese, the leader of Manchester City Council since 1996, who has also been an architect of greater Mancunianism, as has the guy on the bottom left, who was from one of the peripheral authorities who led that voluntary association of Greater Manchester authorities for many years. In the bottom right is our current mayor, Andy Burnham, previously a very significant national political figure who decided to give up his national political career in order to lead Greater Manchester, which I don't think would happen without the spade work of those other 3 characters. Final slide, please. I hope I'm just about on time. Is any of this stuff working? Is an interesting question. Philip's quite right. This is a very recent set of reforms. It has some very big aspirations attached to it, and we are a short period of the way through the development of something which we all hope will prove to be organic and will grow over time. How do we get a handle on that? We are sailing now into a new set of elections in May, so the people will decide how good the job of the combined authority mayors have been. In Greater Manchester's case, the picture is very positive, according to a survey done by one of our national think tanks. Our mayor is extremely well known. He's better known than the London mayor. He's twice as well known as any other of the combined authority mayors. He's the only one whose approval rating for the handle of COVID has been better than that of national government, of local councils, and everybody thinks he should have more powers and responsibilities. 40% think he should have more powers over affordable housing, supporting business, more taxation and spending powers, very significantly, more power over transport services, skills and training. However, echoing Philip's comments, the attitude of national government in the UK is absolutely critical. And just at the moment, partly through the way in which centralisation has dominated the COVID crisis, and the independent strength of devolved institutions has resulted in tension between a centralised approach and what's happening in different parts of the UK. There is a very strong perception just now that devolution leads to a strengthening of independence movements. There is a rowing back from that in our national government, and as a parallel to that, there's also an emerging preference within the current government, rather than to deal with the combined authorities which they themselves have created, to deal directly with districts on lots of issues to do with economic development and regeneration. We will see how that pans out in the future. But just at the moment, there are significant question marks, I think, about the extent to which we'll build quickly on what we've managed to be able to achieve in Greater Manchester. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Thanks again for showing us the GMCA's history and the current situation. Now, we will move on to the discussion session. I'm very happy to be with the prominent experts in this field of devolution from both countries today. Our first panelist is Professor Andrew Westwood from the University of Manchester. Professor Westwood has other commitment today, so he recorded his discussion virtually just before the webinar. We will now watch this together.
Good morning. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person or via Zoom at the seminar today, but technical arrangements prevent that. I hope the seminar is going well and that it becomes a useful exercise in your own plans in Korea to think further about how to make devolution arrangements. I should introduce myself. I'm Andy Westwood. I'm a Professor of Government Practice at the University of Manchester and also Vice Dean for Social Responsibility in the Faculty of Humanities. In the 10 minutes I have for comments, I wanted to focus on three areas that I think are important when we think about devolution in England at this time. The first of those points is that the devolution arrangements that we can see in city regions like Greater Manchester, where I'm based, or Merseyside, the Liverpool city region, in Newcastle, the north of the Tyne region, the West Midlands, around Birmingham, in the centre of England, and in a number of other places too. The first point is that this is still a new set of arrangements. Most of those mayors were only first elected in 2017. And the idea for city region devolution and for so-called metro mayors only really started to gain traction as a policy in 2013, 2014. So we have only had a very, very short period of time in which mayors can actually govern and deliver policy in their respective areas. So on that basis, as mayors have tested the levers and resources that they have been granted over a succession of devolution arrangements, as they have grown capacity, as they've grown understanding, as well as evidence and data about their performance, we see a kind of a policy experiment developing and continuing. And that includes at the national level, as ministers in Westminster and Whitehall look at those arrangements, look at the success, look at their relationship with the mayors as they become established, and decide what they also think about the success or failure of mayors as they've been introduced. This comes to a particular head in the next few weeks as the first wave of city region mayors seek re-election, or most of them seek re-election in the mayoral elections early next month in May. But the most important thing is that this is new. This is still a new set of arrangements. Not everybody has all the information they need to understand whether it is successful, or how it will develop in the future. The second thing I wanted to say is that those arrangements happened in a particular context and they continue to develop in a particular context. And that context matters very significantly to our opinion of mayors, but also the success, both perceived and real, of these new arrangements and their impact on places, big city regions across England. And that context is fundamentally driven by two things. One is that the UK, England, is one of the most centralised nations in governance terms in the developed world. So much of its power, including its financial power, is concentrated at the centre, and local government, including arrangements for mayors, are comparatively weak, with little resource compared not just to the centre in the United Kingdom, but also to comparable cities or city regions or regions elsewhere in Europe and across the world. The second thing to say about that context is that sort of dominance of London and the centre in governance is also matched by the dominance of London and the South East economically. England and the UK suffers from very, very high levels of regional inequality. The highest by some measures, not just in Europe, but across the OECD as well. And by that we mean the gap between the most successful and the richest and most prosperous regions, in this case, London and the South East, and all the other regions, but especially the gap between the richest and the poorest regions in the UK. And by some measures, the UK has 7 of the poorest regions in Europe at this time. But it also applies to the intra-regional inequalities. So there are equally large gaps between the poor parts of regions like Greater Manchester and the richer parts of regions like Greater Manchester. So economic inequality is a major part of that context within which devolution has been introduced and managed. That inequality, that economic inequality around wages, jobs, firms, productivity, was really behind the arrangements that were introduced. And the devolution arrangements that exist in England, in cities like Greater Manchester, have been largely driven by trying to address that economic gap. The arrangements were led by the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, George Osborne, in the coalition government led by the Conservatives, and by the Treasury, the department that he led. And so much of the plan for Metro mayors was to help fill the gap, not just in governance, but in economic performance. More jobs, more growth, more productivity improvement to address this lack of balance across the UK and England as a nation within it. So again, going back to the relatively recent reform, that is not very much time in which those big structural inequalities could have been addressed or solved. And particularly so when we think about the last year and our experiences in the global pandemic with COVID-19 and essentially the putting of whole economies at the city region level or the national level into deep freeze for a moment when normal life and normal work and normal business could resume. The third thing I wanted to say is that there is also a political context. And although George Osborne and David Cameron were the leaders of the Conservative government that gave birth to the devolution arrangements that we now see, we have a different Conservative government now. It is Conservative in name, but it isn't the same Conservative Party. George Osborne and David Cameron are very long gone, and in their place, we have a party that is formed by Brexit, by the campaigning of many of the leading figures in this government to leave the European Union on the basis of economic change, national identity, and famously or infamously, taking back control from the European Union. So far, it's clear that that taking back of powers and control has been to the centre of government, reinforcing those powers that I described in the centre held in the UK, in London, in the southeast, in Westminster and Whitehall, rather than spread out to the cities or regions or nations of the UK as a whole. And what we don't yet know is really what this government thinks about devolution and plans for further waves of change, either more powers to more places or a kind of an increase in powers to those places that already have mayors. In many ways, this is still a new government too. It was elected in December 2019. Brexit was finally concluded early in 2020. And then ever since, they have been managing the impacts of COVID on both our politics and our daily lives. What we know in terms of the relationship between the centre, between the ministers, between Boris Johnson, between Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and others, and the city regions that have mayors, is that COVID has tested that relationship, particularly in places like Greater Manchester, where there were very high-profile arguments about support for businesses and for people, whilst the centre of the UK government introduced local lockdowns, regional lockdowns in the latter part of last year. We don't really know whether this government is keen on more devolution. We don't really know whether this government is at a point where it has gone beyond those experiences during local and regional lockdowns during COVID. So there is another level of political uncertainty about where arrangements will go once the elections for Metro mayors are out of the way in May. So those are the three areas that I think we should bear in mind. One, the arrangements for mayors are still very, very new. Capacity is still being built at the local level, and an understanding of whether it is seen as a success is still being considered at the national level too. Two, this is happening in a context of very, very significant regional and local inequality, and that has characterised the nature of the devolution relationship. It is largely economic, and progress needs to be made on that as the economic plan and the political plan, the governance plan, kind of are kind of incontrovertibly connected. The third is the new government at the national level still does not know what it wants to do with mayors or with devolution, and that lack of knowledge is further soured by some less than positive experiences during COVID and during the local and national arrangements that governments introduced. And so we face an uncertain period. We have elections next month, but any of those candidates standing, including the mayors standing for a second term in office, can't really say with any certainty what will happen with devolution over the next 3 or 4 years, whether there will be more powers, whether central government still continues to think this is a good idea, or whether taking back control remains a slogan about the national level rather than giving new powers to the local or to the city region level or to the mayors that were elected in 2017, in 2018, and will be re-elected next month, now in 2021. So that's all I have to say. I hope it's useful. Thank you for listening, and thank you for allowing me to attend the seminar and to give my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Westwood for providing the issues and perspectives of devolution in England. Thank you also for the comments and the questions. It would be very appreciated if presenters could provide to the comments they received during the Q&A session later. Next, we have Professor Juno Jung from the Gangwon University. Professor Jung, please to make a start.
네, 안녕하십니까. 강원대학교.
Good afternoon. I am Juno Jung from Gangwon National University. Let me first introduce myself. At the late 90s, I once studied in the UK, England. I studied economics, and I also provide lectures on economics. I heard that there are a lot of uncertainties about devolution in the post-COVID era. So I'm going to make some comments about the presentation given by Professor Harding. Devolution that has been implemented recently in the UK seems to be focused on strengthening fiscal discipline of the central government rather than striking a balance between regions. The continued trend of slow growth and fiscal deficit of the UK could result in devolution that does not accompany a full fiscal devolution, exacerbating economic gap among regions. As such, the effect of devolution is deemed to be varied depending on the timing and context. Especially the deal-based devolution in England may differ by example and issue at hand, and could lead to problems in accountability as well as efficiency and effectiveness of policy delivery afterwards. Issues such as transparency in the deal-making process and disparity of deal substance by region could intensify the complexity of local administrative systems and may fail to meet public demand for democratic accountability. The deal could also move toward the direction of a politicized resolution due to time constraint. Slow growth and budgetary limitations at the central government could give rise to situations where local demand for infrastructure cannot be met, and this could intensify fiscal tightening. So I would like to ask you about this issue with devolution. And secondly, regarding city regions have been under the limelight as a spatial unit that could be utilized to resolve metropolitan issues such as economic development, land, housing, investment, and infrastructure. The new type of zoning can be seen as an attempt to build a governance system that mobilizes existing resources based on city regions and respond to problems in the UK. It's about leveraging the agglomeration economy of large cities to the maximum extent as an economic growth engine. The notion assumes the trickle-down effect where benefits of economic development in large cities flow into neighboring areas. However, the network effect may prevent even neighboring hinterlands of the central areas from enjoying such benefit. And England's current policies focused on large cities may be seen as urban exceptionalism that does not consider rural and backward areas. In other words, the decline of local policies and renaissance of urban policies. The main subject in a devolution deal is large city based on the functional region. Although the deals have been implemented to resolve the north-south divide in the UK, with expectations of trickle-down effects stemming from a growth strategy centered on large cities, it could be pointed out that the expected benefit may not be as great. And lastly, growth or devolution policy solely focused on economic value can be problematic. The three factors of embracing society, environmental sustainability, and economic value must be combined, and connection and collaboration between cities and rural areas need to take place to genuinely ease regional divides and for devolution to function. So I would like to ask your take on this matter as well. Thank you for listening to my short comment.
Thank you, Professor John, for providing such a valuable input. It would be great if Mr. Clifford and Professor Harding could please address these questions during the Q&A session later. Our last panelist is Dr. Young-Hoon An from Hansei University. Dr. An, please begin. The floor is yours.
Thank you for kind introduction. So I'm so pleased to have a good opportunity to take part in this web seminars. Before I raise the question, I just want to comment a little bit about the Alan Harding's presentation. Okay, so GMCA is not popped up just suddenly, because he told us the long history since the abolition of the Great Manchester Council. So I think it's this area's political leaders has the consensus on dealing the devolution deal, and they try to be in forefront of the dealing with the government more furthering devolution, I think. And also the consensus, political consensus is very important for us. It's a very meaningful lesson for us. But as Dr. Clifford told us, the local government in English was not protected in a constitutional framework. So just I cannot resist to doubt about the two questions. So the first one is always in every local government I know has the local council constitution. So for us, the meaning of a constitution it's like the national constitution. So it guarantees really the basis of the GMCA, because we wonder always in England and the United Kingdom always change so many organizational structure in local government. It's the first question. So the constitution, about the constitution of GMCA, it guarantees in terms of the importance of secondary legislation power. It's very important, I think, my question. The second one, I want to dive into more detail the financial arrangement of GMCA. Dr. Alan Harding's presentation, I saw very detailed of the budget, but I do not understand is for example, the central government gives so many grants. So I think it's one is the revenue support grant, but the other I heard you call what is this? They call a top up grant. I don't understand what is the top up grant, and what will be the basis from the government, central government, to give that grant to the GMC. So the last question is about the financial arrangement of GMC. Yes, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. An. Dr. An provided two questions from his extensive experience researching the case study of the GMCA. It would be terrific if Professor Harding could please address these questions during the Q&A session later. Now, we move on to the Q&A session. Due to the time limit, I will not repeat individual questions, but I believe the speakers know the specific questions and comments asked in earlier sessions. Firstly, Mr. Clifford, could you please provide the responses to the questions raised to you during the discussion for 2 minutes?
Yes, of course, and thank you for such perceptive and interesting questions. So with regards to the deal-based model, I think there is something, particularly within the context of coronavirus, where if you look at the slides and reflect on both mine and Alan's presentation, combined authorities take a long time to establish. The deal-based process took a long time for local areas to sit down with government. And UK, I guess like most of the world, faced a very rapid period both of transition in terms of changes potentially to economic geography, but also in terms of recovery and wanting to kind of get the engine firing. So it's not really clear that the kind of devolution deal model where these powers of economic interventions are passed down over a long period of years is really going to be sufficient. So I think there is something about that deal model which needs to be reviewed in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. Secondly, there is something around focusing on urban areas that has really put rural economies in the slow lane. And I think that's a real focus for the LGA going forward, about thinking not just about strategic economic architecture and interventions, but also some of the powers and resources that you might want available locally. So, for example, around skills and labour market integration. Yes, you could see the case for strategic transport infrastructure requiring a cross-boundary structure like a combined authority or a Greater London Authority. But at the local level, being able to draw on local labour market intelligence and better connect job seekers with opportunities, it's not really clear that that should be contingent on governance reform. I think one of the real ways to kind of turbocharge kind of rural areas to think about actually passing down the powers that local areas need, you know, without having to hang that on governance reform. And on the question around devolution being tied to economic purposes, I think the way I conceptualize this is you look at something like climate change, a really big problem, really big societal challenge. And if you're a city like Greater Manchester or even London, your ability to tackle climate change is really limited by the institutional and policy architecture of the country. So, for example, the M6 goes around Greater Manchester. It's not responsibility for the combined authority. And so I think we need to start moving towards something more around kind of a new territorial responsibility where strategic authorities like the GMCA are able to bring together national agencies to tackle these things in a holistic manner, because simply parceling out powers along economic lines, I don't think, as has been pointed out, is really sufficient to tackle these large systemic cross-cutting challenges like climate change. Thank you.
Thank you for your valuable response. Next, Professor Harding, could you be able to provide your responses to the questions raised during the discussion session for 2 minutes?
I will do my best, Chair. There were some excellent contributions and questions posed on the Greater Manchester model, and I'd be happy to follow up individually after this event if that's going to be helpful. On the two issues, the constitutional issue, the important thing to recognise is that the UK has no written constitution. Our unwritten constitution effectively says that our national government is all powerful. So local government has no constitutional status. National government can reform, get rid of, transform local government as and when it wishes to take on the political risk and challenge of doing so. So a constitution at the level of a city region can only be a document, a set of protocols and procedures for that particular place. So that's what the GMCA constitution does. It clarifies how those aspects of new powers and resources provided by the deals process is going to be organised and delivered within GMCA, who has responsibility for delivery, and how resources flow, what voting rules should apply to different policy areas, and so on and so forth. It's an attempt to provide clarity on that. On the fiscal question, again, there is a huge difference between what happens in England and in other parts of the UK. So in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, where we've had significant devolution, where there is some constitutional principles involved in the transfer of decision-making power to those levels, there is also a historical agreement whereby there is a guaranteed fiscal share to those countries. It doesn't mean those countries have to raise those resources. There is an automatic guarantee of the flow of resources from the UK to the Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish levels. That doesn't apply within England. So what we have to try and achieve through deals processes is the provision of additional resources. Some of those grants that was hidden in my slide would have flowed to Greater Manchester anyway. So the fact that we have, for example, a transport authority which has a revenue and a capital budget, and some of that money comes from national government. That was always going to be the case. So some of the core budgets of GMCA are effectively the core budgets of the individual institutions that predated the GMCA's creation. However, the additional stuff that has been provided through the deals processes are things like, for example, an extension of the time in which it's possible to guarantee a flow of resources into transport, for example, and into housing. There are specific deals around programs which were formerly delivered by agents of national government, which are now delivered by Greater Manchester level contract in the fields of welfare to work and training and so on. We were given responsibility for adult education, which is organised through our college system. Elsewhere, that money goes direct to colleges. In our case, we can improve the efficiency of the system by dealing on a strategic basis with the college. So there are all sorts of different elements to the monies involved. The important thing in Greater Manchester is to try and use those resources strategically rather than have a war between the various different institutions, each trying to go in the direction that suits them in particular.
Thank you for your insight. Earlier, presenters and panelists provided great insight for the Korean local autonomy. Thank you for that. I would like to ask if panelists could please provide your views on the comments from the presenters and the panelists for 1 minute each. First, if you are okay, Professor Jung, please.
짤막하게 간단히 코멘트를 하겠습니다.
I will make it very brief. Devolution in England in relation to the central government system seems to be having quite a large level of uncertainty. Nevertheless, the greatest implication that we can get from this in Korea is this, I think. In the GMCA case, the uncertainty of infrastructure investment could be done in a rolling investment style in the long term to prevent redundant investment and to set priority in investment. Then this will enable sustainable infrastructure investment, which is a very meaningful lesson for Korea, because in Korea, regional infrastructure are set up through lobbying by the local government, and it's not easy to persuade the central government. But in England, it seems like various CAs or regions get together, use the deal-based process to lay a foundation for growth through the means of infrastructure investment.
Thank you for your thoughtful response. And Dr. An, please.
Yes, thank you. Just I have two observations. Sorry. Yeah, one is the GMCA's biggest spending is the skills and training, maybe for the young generation. So yeah, that's very important, and it's very focusing on the finance. It's very good thing. And the second is now in Korea also we start the second half the municipal police system, but Metro Mayor I think already have the through the vice president the power of the police and crime commission status. I think it also I don't know whether it goes well in GMCA for protecting against the terrorism or something. So that's my second observation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. An. Finally, I would like to ask Mr. Clifford and Professor Harding to provide overall views on the direction of devolution and the future development of devolution in the UK and South Korea for 2 minutes each. First, Mr. Clifford, please.
Thank you. I think my reflection would be that the pandemic has really shone a spotlight on the capacity of a centralized system to deal with both local lockdowns and local outbreaks. I think there's a strong sense that Prime Minister and Number 10 and the various Whitehall agencies had a set of levers that when they wanted to pull and seek direct action, the kind of systems went against them. All the levers were at the centre, but the actual delivery on the ground was a bit fragmented and diffuse. And I think by contrast, local government, despite being slightly divested of constitutional protection and up against a pretty constrained financial environment, has managed to deliver for its communities. They've managed to put together services at speed and develop both civic protection and economic interventions in partnership with both businesses and civic agencies and universities. I think they've really risen to the challenge. And I completely recognise some of the comments made by my colleagues and some of the panel around it being a very uncertain time in UK politics, and the prospects are, I won't say that they're perhaps as clear and open as they were, say, 5-6 years ago under the coalition. But I think it is hard to get away from just the ability. So there's 2 points. One, the ability of councils and local government and combined authorities to deliver for their communities, and two, some of the trust that regional figures like Andy Burnham have with their populace. That's not going to go away. So I think it might be a little uncertain, but in the longer term, both the track record of delivery and some of the actual place-based politics we mentioned earlier have potential to expand the envelope, I think, going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford, for your response. And Professor Harding, please.
I think the one message I take from the English experience with devolution is, and will not go away, is the central importance of big cities to the future economy of nations. So, we share in Korea and the UK a situation in which one big dominant capital region is extremely important to the future of our countries, and we have difficulties in making sure that the benefits of change in one area of the country influence trajectories in the others. The importance of cities in that respect seems to me to be absolutely central, and whatever course the future economy takes, it's going to be cities that will lead change in the future, it seems to me. The trick is recognizing that in policy terms and giving some institutional support to make sure that we make the best of all of our major cities. The city region construction can include rural areas. Let's remember, it's we can draw boundaries of our city regions as large as we wish. The critical thing from the Greater Manchester experience is to get a degree of consensus between each of those different parts of a city region, that they do share challenges and their futures are interlinked, to have a narrative around that which they can all buy into, and to choose forms of institutional development which are not too threatening to any of them, that allow movement and allow evolution of institutional change rather than revolution. That's what Greater Manchester has managed to do in the English context. So, the mayor is powerful, but he's not all powerful. He chooses his cabinet. He doesn't choose his cabinet. He is given his cabinet, who are the 10 district leaders. And each of those 10 district leaders lead on a particular aspect of Greater Manchester institutional business. It's a shared model of leadership with a focus on the mayor. And the reason it takes that form is because none of the authorities would have automatically said, we need a mayor and we will give our power away. So think carefully about evolution rather than revolution, how you get a narrative and how you sell that to a national government who may not always believe what you're telling them.
Thank you, Professor Harding. Okay, we have had a very interesting question from the audience, which we received from the email and live chat. The first question comes from Mr. Hae-sung Lee from the local government in Korea, Yeongdong-gun, Chungcheongbuk-do Province. Let me read the question. Under the pressure and crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, how does the developed system work regarding cooperation with the central government? What kind of obstacles for the combined authorities in England were there with procuring PPE, rolling out the vaccine, and stimulating the bounce back of the economy? This is a very detailed question. Nowadays, the current situation in England. Thank you, Mr. Hae-sung Lee. Would anyone like to respond to the first question? Okay, Mr. Clifford, could you kindly respond to this question within 2 minutes, please?
Certainly, and it is an interesting question. So I'd say, by way of response, that within the UK there are certainly, as we touched on earlier, differential functional responsibilities for each of the devolved administrations. Scotland, Wales, they have powers over health, and they clearly have different national and local lockdowns. Within England, it's largely the kind of purview of the NHS, working with local partners on the ground, and there isn't really a concentration of devolved health responsibility, of course, with the exception of Greater Manchester, which we've heard is more delegation. And I think, just to reinforce what I said earlier, some of that Whitehall centralisation, I think, created barriers initially. I think some of the job of local government and the combined authorities has been really to bring together different government departments that have a tendency, unfortunately, to operate in silos and not very well together. And local government's role has really been to bring together different national interventions in place and explain, for example, the interaction between public health concerns, business concerns, and transport concerns. For example, you can imagine public transport and raise a whole load of issues about wearing masks and timetabling and economic viability that only really come together in place. So I think local authorities have been really effective at doing that. In terms of the organising the vaccine and local lockdowns, again, local government has been crucial partners with national government. And I think that's been one of the key things, that local government has managed to work with a centralised system and really demonstrated its value and really swung together on behalf of our communities. And in terms of, I guess, stimulating the bounce back, I think the real test will be to see how much of what has happened during the pandemic actually sticks. So in terms of people working from home and people perhaps moving out of cities, or cities reconfiguring themselves and new urban ecosystems, I think the jury's still out. And I think combined authorities and their local partners and councils are really keen to understand what's actually going to happen and work with government on perhaps thinking about the medium-term future of cities and medium-term future of urban areas, non-urban areas, before acting. But I think there's still a little uncertainty about how much of this is actually going to stick and how much we're going to see things go back to the way they were before. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clifford. The second question comes from Ms. Soon Kim in Jeju Special Self-Governing Province. Let me read the question. One of the main purposes of the establishment of the GMCA is to contribute to improving quality of life or enhancing local economic development. Could you please describe a project which is a good example of this? Thank you, Ms. Soon Kim. For the second question, I think Professor Harding, could you kindly provide this answer to this question within 2 minutes, please?
Okay, so The story of Greater Manchester is largely about responding to the economic challenges posed by the deindustrialisation of Manchester over the latter part of the 20th century. So it is understandable that there was an economic orientation to the GMCA's work. However, with the advent of the mayor, issues regarding the quality of life and inequalities of economic outcomes have come to the fore. Though many of his initiatives, for example, have been in what we might call more social policy areas, on street sleeping, on education and training, on public service reform. So you can see an expansion in the agenda of the GMCA. The one thing that connects both the economy and quality of life more generally, I think, is the central importance of transport infrastructure and enabling people to get around the conurbation freely, easily. The one initiative I think that connects the two is the way in which Greater Manchester has been able to develop its own transport system, often with the resistance of national government, but eventually triumphing and getting investment into, first of all, a new tram system, which predated the GMCA, but has continued to develop. And secondly, to introduce or to lobby to introduce what the mayor is describing as a London-style integrated transport system with common ticketing and the re-regulation of our bus service. Those things will be happening in the second term of the mayor's the second term of the mayor, whichever mayor we get, I would guess, because the spade work has been done, and it wouldn't have been possible without the structures that we've created.
Thank you, Professor Harding, for your great response and kind response. Now, we conclude today's event. I really would like to express our deepest gratitude to our panelists and presenters and audience members from both the UK and Korea, who have been so kind to offer us their time and expertise. We are very grateful to our speakers and enjoyed stimulating and interesting discussion. I hope all you found this event helpful and insightful. We hope to host another webinar in the near future. Thank you very much for your attendance and participation. See you again. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.